Frank's weathered hands trembled as he reached for his coffee cup. A 20-something man at the next table snickered, nudging his friend. "Look at the old-timer shaking like a leaf." Frank's eyes flickered, calm, pained, but harboring secrets no civilian could fathom. Every Thursday morning for the past 7 years, Frank Wilson followed the same routine. The 70-year-old Vietnam veteran would wake at 5:30 a.m., complete his physical therapy exercises despite the pain in his joints, and walk 3 blocks to Riverside Café by 7:15. The small coffee shop nestled in the heart of Millfield, Pennsylvania, had become his anchor in a life otherwise defined by solitude. Frank always ordered the same thing, black coffee and wheat toast, and sat at the same corner table that offered a clear view of both the entrance and the street outside. Old habits from another lifetime. The cafe staff knew him as the quiet, polite elderly man who tipped well and spoke little. What they didn't know was that Staff Sergeant Frank Wilson had once been among the most decorated snipers in the 25th Infantry Division during Vietnam. His hands hadn't always trembled. The involuntary shaking began years after his 3rd tour, along with the nightmares and the hypersensitivity to sudden noises. The doctors called it PTSD. Frank simply considered the price of surviving when so many others hadn't. Today, the cafe was busier than usual. A group of young professionals occupied the large table near the window, their laughter and animated conversations filling the space. Frank noticed everything. The businessman reading his paper by the door, the young mother with twin toddlers struggling to keep them entertained, the new waitress nervously balancing a tray of drinks. His situational awareness remained razor-sharp despite his age. Sarah, his regular waitress, approached with a warm smile. "Morning, Mr. Wilson." The usual. Frank nodded, returning her smile with a slight one of his own. "Thank you, Sarah." As she walked away, he felt the familiar tremor in his left hand intensify. Some days were worse than others. Today would prove to be one of those days, though not for the reasons he might have expected. The bell above the door chimed as 3 more customers entered. Young men in their mid-20s wearing expensive casual clothes and exuding the confidence of those who never faced real adversity. They took the table adjacent to Frank's, loudly discussing last night's basketball game. One of them, tall with styled brown hair and designer glasses, kept glancing at Frank, particularly at his trembling hands as he carefully lifted his coffee cup. Frank had seen that look before, a mixture of discomfort, judgment, and misplaced superiority. Bet he can't even feed himself without wearing half of it. The young man, Kyle Peterson, according to the employee badge clipped his jacket, whispered to his friends, just loud enough for Frank to hear. His companions laughed, though one of them had the decency to look embarrassed. Frank gave no indication he'd heard, though decades of training had made his hearing exceptionally acute. He simply continued methodically spreading butter on his toast, despite how the tremors made the task challenging. Sarah returned with a coffee refill, noticing Kyle's smirk. "Can I get you gentlemen anything else?" she asked, her tone noticeably cooler than usual. "We're good," Kyle replied, then added, "but maybe get the old guy a sippy cup before he spills everywhere." Sarah's face flushed with anger. "Sir, I'd appreciate it if you—" "It's all right," Frank interjected quietly. "No harm done." Kyle turned to his friends as Sarah walked away. "My grandfather was in Vietnam too, but he doesn't shake like he's having a seizure. Guess some guys just couldn't handle it, you know? Came back all messed up." Frank's steady gaze shifted momentarily to Kyle, then back to his coffee. Anyone trained to read faces might have noticed the subtle change in his eyes. Not anger, but a deep, contained awareness, like still water running very deep. The young mother with twins dropped a spoon, creating a sudden clatter. Frank's hand jerked involuntarily, spilling a few drops of coffee. Kyle and his friends erupted in poorly concealed laughter. "Jesus, look at him jump. Probably thinks he's still in the jungle," Kyle said, making no effort to lower his voice now. "These old war relics should stay home if they can't keep it together in public." Frank dabbed the spilled coffee with a napkin, his movements deliberate and composed. He'd endured far worse than the mockery of ignorant young men. But something in Kyle's expression, the sheer dismissive cruelty, suggested this confrontation was just beginning. 20 minutes passed with Kyle occasionally glancing at Frank, making comments to his friends that grew progressively louder. Several other customers had begun to notice, exchanging uncomfortable looks but saying nothing. The atmosphere in the usually pleasant cafe had grown tense. Finally, Kyle pushed back his chair and stood. His friends watched with a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity as he approached Frank's table. "Hey there, sir," Kyle said, his tone falsely respectful, dripping with sarcasm. "I couldn't help but notice you're having a hard time with your coffee. It must be tough being so jumpy." Frank looked up, meeting Kyle's eyes directly for the first time. Something in the older man's steady gaze made Kyle falter momentarily before regaining his smirk. "I manage fine, thank you," Frank replied, his voice quiet but clear, carrying the calm authority that once commanded men in combat. "Do you, though?" Kyle persisted, gesturing to Frank's hands. "Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're terrified of your own shadow. What kind of soldier comes home afraid of coffee cups?" A heavy silence fell over the cafe. Even Kyle's friends looked uncomfortable now, one of them calling out, "Come on, man, that's enough." But Kyle was committed to his cruelty now. "I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. If he was as scared in Vietnam, no wonder we lost the war." Frank's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, an almost imperceptible straightening of his spine, a slight repositioning of his feet under the table. Not preparation for confrontation, but the unconscious body language of a man who had once been ready for anything at a moment's notice. Sarah approached quickly, coffee pot in hand. "Sir, I think you should return to your table." Kyle waved her off. "I'm just having a conversation with our veteran here. Teaching moment, right? Showing respect for my elders and all that." Frank remained silent, his gaze evaluating Kyle with the same detached calculation he once used to survey landscapes for threats. It wasn't anger in his eyes, it was assessment. What might have happened next changed in an instant as the bell above the door chimed again, this time followed by someone shouting, "Everybody down! Now!" Two men in black hoodies and ski masks burst through the door. The first held a handgun, waving it wildly at the customers. The second carried a large hunting knife, moving quickly to block the exit to the kitchen. "This is a robbery. Phones and wallets on the tables." "Now!" the gunman shouted, his voice muffled by the mask but clearly edged with desperation. Chaos erupted. The young mother pulled her twins under the table, covering them with her body. The businessman by the door froze, newspaper still in hand. Kyle stumbled backward, nearly falling as he scrambled away from Frank's table, diving beneath his own. "Hurry up! Money, jewelry, everything." The second robber moved between tables, collecting valuables in a backpack, roughly grabbing a gold necklace from an elderly woman's neck. Throughout the cafe, people were crying, pleading, or frozen in terror. Everyone except Frank. His trembling had stopped completely. In moments of extreme stress, time often seems to slow down for combat veterans. For Frank, the world suddenly came into sharp focus. His hands, now perfectly steady, carefully set down his coffee cup. His breathing slowed, eyes rapidly scanning the situation, cataloging details that most civilians would miss in their panic. The gunman's inexperienced grip, the nervous shifting of his weight, the knife wielder's erratic movements suggesting possible drug use. The gunman approached Sarah, who stood paralyzed with the coffee pot still in hand. "Register. Open it now," he demanded, pressing the gun against her ribs. The second robber grabbed the elderly woman by her hair when she couldn't remove her wedding ring fast enough. "Take it off or I cut the finger off," he threatened, pressing the knife against her wrinkled hand. Frank saw the woman's terrified eyes, heard her whimper. Something cold and precise clicked into place within him, a familiar state of mind he hadn't accessed in decades. The old soldier wasn't trembling anymore. As the armed robber dragged Sarah toward the register, Frank's perception heightened to a level most people never experience. He noted the distance to both assailants, 12 feet and 18 feet respectively, cataloged potential weapons within reach, heavy ceramic mug, metal napkin holder, butter knife, and mapped the positions of all civilians in the room. The gunman had his back partially turned now, attention focused on forcing Sarah to open the register. The knife wielder was still threatening the elderly woman, becoming increasingly agitated by her fumbling attempts to remove her wedding ring. Most importantly, Frank observed that the gunman's finger was resting alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. The mark of someone unfamiliar with firearms. The knife wielder was a more immediate threat to a civilian. Frank made his decision. His movements were so sudden and fluid that most customers would later struggle to describe exactly what happened. One moment, the 70-year-old veteran was sitting quietly. The next, he was in motion. Frank grasped a heavy ceramic mug and sent it flying with remarkable precision at the gunman's hand. The impact caused him to drop the weapon with a howl of pain. In the same motion, Frank had already closed half the distance to the knife wielder, moving with a speed that belied his age. The knife wielder turned, startled by his partner's cry, brandishing his blade toward Frank. "Stay back, old man." But Frank was already inside the effective range of the knife, executing a precise sequence of movements that spoke of thousands of hours of close combat training. His left hand deflected the knife arm while his right delivered a devastating strike to the attacker's throat. Enough pressure to incapacitate, without causing permanent damage. As the knife wielder collapsed, gasping for breath, Frank secured the weapon and turned toward the gunman, who was scrambling to retrieve his fallen pistol. "I wouldn't," Frank said, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in the jungle heat of Vietnam. "The safety's off, and you're more likely to shoot yourself than anyone else." The gunman froze, eyes wide with shock beneath his mask. "Face down, hands behind your head," Frank instructed, as calmly as if he were ordering another coffee. "Now." The gunman complied. Only then did the café erupt in gasps and exclamations as the customers processed what they just witnessed. A 70-year-old man with trembling hands had neutralized two armed robbers in less than 10 seconds. Kyle emerged slowly from under his table, face pale with shock. His eyes met Frank's. The terrified old-timer, now standing calmly between two subdued attackers, holding the knife with the practiced grip of someone intimately familiar with weapons. "Someone call 911, Frank said to the room at large, his voice still remarkably steady. "And please check on the woman." They were threatening. "Make sure she's all right." Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder as customers cautiously emerged from their hiding places. Frank had the robber seated against the wall, the knife safely stowed on a high shelf. He'd returned to his table, sipping his now-cold coffee as if nothing extraordinary had happened. 3 police cars pulled up outside, and officers rushed in with weapons drawn, quickly taking control of the situation. The last to enter was an older officer with captain's bars on his uniform. The captain surveyed the scene, then did a double-take when he spotted Frank. "Wilson? Frank Wilson?" he asked, holstering his weapon. Frank nodded slightly. "Hello, Jim. Been a while." Captain James Rogers approached Frank with visible respect. "Should have known you'd be in the middle of this. These men giving you trouble, Staff Sergeant?" The title caught everyone's attention. Kyle, who had been giving a statement to another officer, turned to stare. "Nothing I couldn't handle," Frank replied modestly. The captain turned to his officers. "This gentleman here is Staff Sergeant Frank Wilson, 25th Infantry Division, one of the most decorated snipers in Vietnam. Confirmed kills record that still stands today." A murmur ran through the café. The businessman by the door whispered, "Holy shit." Frank served 3 tours. The captain continued, earned 2 Purple Hearts, a Silver Star, and was recommended for the Medal of Honor after he single-handedly held off an enemy battalion to allow his wounded teammates to evacuate. Frank looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Jim, that's not necessary. They should know who they've been sitting with," the captain insisted, then addressed the room. "That tremor in his hands comes from nerve damage after he was captured and tortured for 18 days before escaping with 3 other POWs. Sarah gasped, her hand covering her mouth. Captain Rogers put a hand on Frank's shoulder. After Vietnam, Frank joined the police force, served 20 years before retiring, trained half the SWAT team tactics they still use today. The cafe had fallen completely silent. Kyle stared at the floor, his face flushed with shame. Those tremors never stopped him from being the best marksman on the force, either, the captain added. He just learned to work with them. His hands might shake when he's calm, but they've always been steady when it matters. Frank sighed. "You done embarrassing me, Jim?" The captain smiled. "Just setting the record straight." He turned to Kyle. "Young man, I believe you were saying something about terrified old-timers earlier?" Kyle couldn't meet anyone's eyes. The revelation of who Frank truly was. Not a frightened old man, but a war hero whose courage and skill had saved lives today and long ago, had rendered him speechless. As the police escorted the handcuffed robbers out, the cafe owner, Mr. Grayson, approached Frank's table. "Mr. Wilson, I don't know how to thank you," he said, voice thick with emotion. "Sarah told me what happened. You saved my staff, my customers. I'm in your debt." Frank shook his head slightly. Anyone would have done the same. "But they didn't," Mr. Grayson insisted. Everyone else froze. "You acted." Captain Rogers rejoined them after supervising the robbers' transport. "These two are wanted in connection with 3 other armed robberies. They hurt people in the last one. You probably saved lives today, Frank." Other customers began approaching, offering thanks and apologies for not standing up for him earlier. The elderly woman whose ring had nearly been taken presented Frank with a trembling kiss on the cheek. "My late husband was in Korea," she told him. "He would have been proud to see what you did today." Frank accepted their gratitude with quiet dignity. The tremor in his hands had returned, stronger now that the danger had passed. Sarah brought him a fresh cup of coffee. On the house, Kyle had remained behind. Even after his friends left, he hovered at the edge of the gathering, clearly wrestling with his conscience. Finally, as the crowd around Frank thinned, Kyle approached the table. "Sir," he began, voice barely audible. I don't know what to say. I was cruel and ignorant, and..." He swallowed hard. "I'm deeply ashamed of how I behaved." Frank studied the young man for a long moment. "You know why my hands shake, son?" Kyle shook his head, unable to meet Frank's eyes. "Because I've seen things no one should see, done things no one should have to do." Frank's voice remained gentle. "These tremors remind me daily of the cost of war. They're not a weakness. They're a testament to survival." Kyle finally looked up, tears in his eyes. "I had no right to judge you." "No, you didn't," Frank agreed. "But ignorance isn't the same as malice. You know better now. That's how we learn." Captain Rogers, who had overheard the exchange, added, "Frank here runs a support group for veterans at the community center every Tuesday. Maybe you'd like to come sometime, hear some of their stories." Kyle nodded earnestly. "I would, if that would be all right, sir." Frank's weathered hand, still trembling slightly, reached for his coffee cup. "We all have something to teach each other, young man." Tuesday at 7. 1 week later, Frank entered Riverside Cafe at his usual time. The atmosphere shifted noticeably as he walked in, not with tension as before, but with a warm recognition. Several customers nodded respectfully. Sarah greeted him with a bright smile. "Your usual table is ready, Mr. Wilson," she said, leading him to his corner spot. Frank noticed something new on the wall beside his table. A framed display of military photographs and medals. Mr. Grayson had created a small wall of honor featuring local veterans, with Frank's service photo prominently placed in the center. "The community donated these," Sarah explained, following his gaze. "Once people heard what happened, veterans and their families started bringing in photos. Mr. Grayson says it's long overdue." Frank nodded, unexpectedly moved by the gesture. As he settled into a seat, the bell above the door chimed. Kyle entered, accompanied by 3 other young men and women. Unlike the friends he'd been with before, these young people carried themselves differently. More respectfully, more purposefully. Kyle approached Frank's table. "Good morning, Staff Sergeant Wilson. I wonder if we might join you? These are students from the Community College Veterans Outreach Program." Frank gestured to the empty chairs. "Please." As the young people introduced themselves, Sarah brought coffee for everyone. She leaned down to whisper to Frank, "Kyle's been volunteering at the VA hospital 3 times this week." Frank watched the transformation in the young man who had mocked him days earlier. How quickly judgment can turn understanding when we see beneath the surface of others. Perhaps that was the greatest battlefield lesson of all, that courage wears many faces, and strength isn't always visible to the untrained eye. The hardest battle, he told the students, his hands trembling slightly as he raised his coffee, isn't fought with weapons. It's the one inside when you come home to a world that doesn't understand what you've seen. He looked around the cafe, at the wall of honor, at Kyle's attentive face, at Sarah's kind smile, and realized that sometimes the most important victories aren't won in dramatic moments of crisis, but in quiet moments of connection afterward. As morning sunlight streamed through the windows, Frank Wilson's shaking hands became not a symbol of weakness, but a powerful reminder that our greatest heroes often walk among us unrecognized until the moment when their quiet strength reveals itself. Have you ever misjudged someone based on appearances only to discover hidden depths? Share your story in the comments. And if you know a veteran, take a moment today to thank them, not just for their service in uniform, but for the countless ways they continue to serve, even when their hands shake.